Hello, everyone. Today we have our new podcast, Inside Life Science Investments. And today I invited as a guest Juan Pablo Orlov, and he is business administration and management specialist, nowadays working in Biotech venture capital. Welcome, Juan.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Can you please talk about your experience for us to understand why do you want to talk about this topic today?
Absolutely. Like you said, I have a business background, but fresh out of college, I started working at a biotech company, actually a biotech startup that makes natural colorants using fungi. And I was the first business hire. I grew a lot as the startups started growing. We raised a very big seed round. We raised Latin America's largest seed round for biotech at $6.4 million. And then I basically fell in love with the whole model of venture capital, of taking these innovations that are groundbreaking and have the potential of changing so many industries. So after working at another startup, I joined a VC firm that specializes in investing in biotech startups.
Mhm. Thank you. As I know, this company name is GridX. And can you tell more about this company? What are you doing? What is your special about it, especially connected to Biotech venture capital?
Sure. So GridX is a VC firm that has a company building model. So 7 years ago, the founder of GridX, Matthias Peyre, he realized that in Latin America there was a lot of potential for creating biotech startups. We have a lot of successful entrepreneurs, and the scientists of the region always rank very high on international prestige publications. So it was fairly obvious that this new wave of biotech startups would emerge from Latin America. However, in Latin America, we do not have an ecosystem where academia talks with entrepreneurs. So it's not that easy for someone with a business background to find a scientific team with an idea to take that to market. That's why at GridX, we developed this system where we look for business entrepreneurs and scientific projects. We select 20 of each, 20 business people and 20 scientific projects from all over the region. And we run this 3 month long program where they have the opportunity to talk to each other and figure out if they want to start a new company with the other side. It's like a mutual choice. We use a lot of dating analogies because it's people figuring out if they want to build a long-term life project with the other part. And in that sense, we have created 81 startups so far in these past 7 years. And at the end of this 3 month block, we decide in which projects to invest. We typically aim to invest on 10 of these projects, but last year we saw so much potential that we ended up investing in 14 of those 20 projects. And after doing that, we have another block of 3 months where we work with these newly created startups and we try to help them in putting those $250,000 that we invest as their pre-seed round to start scaling and looking for other investors because biotechnology has this aspect that there is no such thing as bootstrapping. This is because you have very long development time. On top of that, you have to manage your IP, so getting a patent takes a long time. And on top of that, in the big majority of cases, you have to go through regulatory approval because one cannot just go around selling novel foods or novel therapies. you need a government to approve what you're selling.
Hmm. And if we continue this topic about what is special about biotech investment from the investor point of view, I know that not all the investors are ready to invest in biotech, and why is that so? And even more interesting, why some investors that do invest it anyway?
That's a great question. First of all, I think it's very important to have someone in your team if you are not the investor who has the scientific knowledge. As I said, I have a business background, so my specialty is in understanding the basic context of each scientific project and then try to figure out how to determine the potential in the market. But I can only do this because of the amazing scientific team that we have at GridX. We have many PhDs that do not only have this deep understanding of the science, but also are trained to think like a business person and imagine the potential that this scientific project has. So, first thing would be having the scientific background or having someone in your team that has the ability to determine how feasible this is. I mean, most of these scientific projects are borderline sci-fi. I can take you to an example. Some scientists in Uruguay, they discover a bacteria in Antarctica that has the capability of repairing the DNA damage caused by UV radiation. So they can make products that have the ability to prevent skin cancer. So when a group of scientists come with this discovery, if you don't have a scientific background, how are you supposed to know if this is even possible? So on top of that, you also have to understand that the metrics are very different. Let's take, for example, more traditional investment in startups. You have customers, you have revenue, you have the cost of acquiring customers. It is rarely the case in biotech that you have such metrics. And this is because of the long time that it gets to start selling, but also because you're usually selling to big corporations, like big food companies, big pharmaceutical companies. So you're more likely to have like big contracts, but like in let's say 6 years. The challenge then becomes how do we measure the progress of this startup? And I could talk about hours of this because it would be managing your product pipeline, understanding the technology readiness level of each of your products. On top of that, one should also analyze the chance of success. And if you don't have a technical background, it's nearly impossible to do all this. So another thing is that the time to exit, some people say that it's not longer, but what I can say is that it is very unusual to have an exit in, let's say, 3 years. I've seen a lot of companies, especially in Latin America, that have like a logistics company for food delivery, and they build this up, and in 2 or 3 years, they may get acquired because there's a bigger player trying to get into that country, so they just acquire the new company and that's it. But it's rarely the case with biotech because of all the IP, of all the long, hard process that you have to go until you have a solid product.
And what amount of age is like 5, 7 years, or like mostly frequent, or 10 years, or I don't know, 15 years, or what is it? The number, just interesting.
It's very likely to be close to 7 to 10 years, but again, there are always exceptions. We already had an exit on our portfolio, and the company was, I believe, 3 or 4 years old. And then it's more likely to look at a 10-year horizon, which makes it very challenging on top of that, because if you are creating funds that have a 10-year life, then you're talking in like, unless that your exits are generated by the investments on year number one, you're looking into investing on your next fund on a startup that you invested on your previous one because of the time that it takes to get that. And I would also like to mention that this is a fairly new industry, at least for venture capital perspective. The exception would be biopharma. There's a whole economic model built around making new therapies that has been around for 30 or 40 years, but with biotech in materials, with food, with agricultural solutions, the world leading biotech accelerator is only a year older than GridX. So we are talking about a fund that was created 8 years ago. So they haven't even gone through a whole cycle. And that's what also makes it very challenging for us working at VC firms to pitch our fund to LPs, to potential investors that can believe in our mission.
So as I understand now, there is a system that more or less there is some ecosystem, for example, like GridX, yes, that creates enough scientific and business expertise and technical base who can make clear metrics and identify the profitable, interesting project. And after that, you go to some VC firms or maybe even angel investor and you ask them to fund because you have some proven metrics for them. And do you do some kind of guarantee or safe agreements or what? How do you juridically work with them? Mostly interesting is the ecosystem.
The VC ecosystem for biotech or deep tech startups is definitely way more developed in the US and also in Europe. So every time that we invest in a biotech startup that starts in Latin America, it's almost a no-brainer to go and ask for VC money in the US. And then on top of that, there are uh, angel investors here in Latin America, but again, most of them are in the US. Those angel investors usually have also strong connections to potential clients and other VC firms in the US. So the ecosystem is there, it's growing, but is lacking here in Latin America. And actually, going back to what I was talking before about the need of creating these startups comes from the fact that usually in Latin America, most of the scientific innovation for big multinational companies come from their headquarters, and their headquarters usually are located either in the US, Europe, maybe Asia. So when you have big, let's say, for example, pharmaceutical companies in Argentina, Uruguay, any country in the region, when they have new products, they are actually brought from the R&D that they did in those other sides of the world. This means that there isn't a developed ecosystem of R&D for companies. This leads to having most of the scientific community, which has a lot of reputation and has an amazing talent, working in academia because they already brought the innovation. So that's why we have to roll up our sleeves and find the scientific projects in academia and also find the business people that are out there in the region to create these startups. This doesn't happen in the US. In the US, it's more common that you have big scientific names working in huge companies that then just run into a business person. We say here that in Latin America, there are very two separate worlds, the scientific and the business world, but only because most of the R&D is done in academia. So they are more focused on publishing papers, on sharing knowledge instead of turning that knowledge into a company. And that's where we come in.
Mm. Sounds amazing. And academia, you mean it's mostly research laboratories and universities, yes, so kind of private or mostly even governmental organizations.
It's usually mostly government. There are, of course, private universities, but the R&D is generated by these public universities. They have grants, they have a salary, and they end up licensing the technology that the startup then uses. Because let's not forget that these discoveries, these trips to Antarctica, were paid by a government that funded these expeditions. It's not like the scientists had their own company before. It's not like the scientists had their own money to go literally to the end of the world to do this research. So that's why once we invest in these companies, we start a process of license, of taking these companies to license the technology to secure that IP, and then on top of that, they start creating new IP with other molecules, let's say, or other solutions.
And what is your relationship with government? Does it help you, or sometimes you have problem? Can the government be a co-founder of a startup, or you never have this case? What is the system? Interesting.
In our case, all of our investors, all of our LPs come from private funds. We do have um, the IBD as an LP, the International Development Bank, as an investor, but that's a whole other story. It's not a government on itself. With the government, we usually don't have any issues, but we also don't have much of areas in common to work together. It usually comes more on a macro level of saying, okay, let's say in this specific country, they always have issues for importing some chemicals, which are key, for example, for their development. It usually has to do more with a macro level. Um, Sometimes Latin American countries go through very rough times in terms of either political or economical stability. So that brings another set of challenge that perhaps you wouldn't find in another region of the world. But again, thanks to the talent that we have here in the region, we are able to thrive in the middle of this crisis.
Yeah, so it looks like inspiring heroes of science. Anyway, people continue their work despite of all obstacles, and it's very inspiring. Um, I'm interested about the intellectual property. You just said that mostly the teams that start to work with you already had that, or you have a situation when you start without the intellectual property and you support the teams and help them to register it. When is the best time for a biotech startup to do the intellectual property?
Always as soon as possible. I mean, it's kind of the chicken of the egg sometimes because until you don't have the startup, you don't have to worry about protecting your IP, but you always should be very mindful about your IP, and it's definitely what makes or breaks a startup. The IP also, I would like to paint a broader picture and say that it's not only your IP, but also your capability of producing IP. And with that, I want to go into the scientific team. So, yes, have a very strong IP strategy to build an IP portfolio about your scientific development, but also make sure that you have the right team that will keep producing your IP. Because at an early stage, you can say that the IP is what creates the opportunity of making a lot of money in the future. The promise of making that money, of course, helps to the valuation, but also the promise of making more IP that will make even more money. We always talk about the concept of platform. So if you are a biotech startup that makes natural food currents, like the startup that I used to work for, it's not like, okay, you have red, amazing, you have a fantastic food ingredient. Actually, you want to promise that you can make other currents. And what about flavors? What about fragrances? Are you also able to do that? And if the answer is yes, then you can increase your total addressable market and also diminish risk because, as I was mentioning earlier, when you do the portfolio management of your products, you can say, okay, if this colorant doesn't work, we have a backup plan for that. So you can make like a weighted average percentage of success, and that also helps because, like they say, you don't have all the eggs in the same basket.
And do you register your IP in United States, or you have your own, or there is some international organizations that doing that?
There's an international treaty where most of Latin American countries are participating, and recently here in Uruguay, they signed to be part of this agreement called PCT, and that makes everything smoother because you don't have to be registering your IP on every country. And we also you just go straight into top law firms in the US that specialize in doing this kind of IP protection because, like they say, it's something that you want to keep your eye on.
And other topic is still interesting to talk about the risky because why people think biotech startup are risky? Because in venture capital world, it's something everyone talk about that like biotech, it's risky project. Or especially if we talk of what is more interesting for our community is biotech health related startups.
So they are risky. The question is, are they riskier than other industries? Because back then, they used to say, don't meet strangers in the internet and don't get into cars with strangers. And now you have Uber. So you basically meet strangers in the internet to get into their cars. So that was risky at the time. We are taking that to a whole new level with science. And it's risky because we can't even talk about the adoption. We are talking about the potential of a technology because we are one step back on the chain of logic. We are not talking about is are people going to use this? The assumption has to be yes, because who doesn't want to have their DNA damage repaired and prevent skin cancer? The question is the unit of economics there? Is the are the laws of thermodynamics against you? Are you going to be able to protect? Are you going to be able to get this through regulatory approval? So it's a whole different type of risk. One could argue that it's higher than other industries where you're just using technology to make a business. So we are not using technology to make a business. We are making the technology to then make a business. That could make it riskier. But then again, I think, I don't know who said this, but um, everything is riskier when you don't have the specific knowledge. So if you have a big scientific team that is able to go through all the experiments that this startup did, you get to talk with industry experts. You get to understand what potential clients would want out of this technological solution. Then the risk goes lower. I think it has way more to do with being a very particular set of knowledge that one needs to have to understand the risk. And since it's uncommon, it's usually riskier for the general population. That's why VC firms that are not specialized on investing in biotech, they're going to have way more risk when investing in scientific companies.
Hmm. And from your experience, you were talking that in your company about 20 scientific projects start the acceleration program, and then only 10 or a little bit more can be the winners. And I think in this period of time, you can talk about most common mistakes. If you can share some experience, maybe one of scientists now listening to us and thinking, wow, I can do it. So what common mistakes can be there and how to avoid them?
So we always say that team is first, second, and third. It's very important to build a very strong connection with the rest of your co-founders. Founders breakup are awful because they basically put the whole life of the project in danger. And one thing that we always like to highlight at GridX is that during this 3 month period where the business profiles get to meet the scientific project, we love to stand on the sidelines. So it's not like we see business person A and we say, oh, you should really talk to scientific project number one or number two, and then business person B, you should talk to this one. We want to make it as organic as possible because that's how we think that you get the most genuine connection and the stronger bond so that when problems arise, because problems will arise, you're not going to be, oh yeah, this is GridX fault because they decided that we should work together. No, no, like you were fully responsible of doing this, so it makes it stronger because that's one thing. And yeah, like I think building on top of that would be also talking with anticipation of subjects. We say that usually most problems arise from not having discussed beforehand what they were going to treat, things like that. Like, I thought you were going to do it, you thought I was going to do it, nobody did it. We got a lot of examples of saying, I wasn't expecting this, I didn't know that I was supposed to do this, I didn't know that we had to make all this effort in this direction, let's say, not
So you mean
effort in itself, but
operations and project planning mistakes, yes?
yeah, yeah. And then I'd say also uh, understanding the VC game because it's a very particular game, and understanding this logic of okay, we need to raise enough money to get to the next round. We need to communicate how much money we are raising, why are we raising this amount, what are we going to do with this amount of money, and how is that going to allow us to go in the 10-year vision that we are going. So there are a lot of moving parts, but if I had to summarize, it would be choosing your co-founders very, very wisely, and then managing that relationship, but also managing your relationship with potential investors.
And a few more questions before we end. How about the public opinion? Can it be a situation that, for example, we start to producing any drug or something specific type of chemical, and then I don't know, the environmental societies are against it, makes ambushes. Is it true that public opinion can influence, or in general, it's not really important because they kind of influence and then it degrees and you just continue on? What do you think about the influence of public opinion?
Let me answer you the second part of the question. I definitely believe that public opinion plays a major role. First, in the regulators' eyes. So let's not forget that the people that work on regulating new products or current products, uh, in that case, are part of the government. And if you live in a place where you got democracy, then you got people not only voting but also making petitions and finding scientific literature that indicates that something must be approved or not. Let's not forget that we are not only talking about approving new ingredients, for example, with the colorants, but also banning, taking current alternatives out of the market because of the harmful effects that it's being proved that have in human health. For example, California and then the whole US banning the colorant red number three. So you got public opinion influencing the regulators, but let's also not forget that public opinion means customers. And customers not only vote for the government, they also vote with their dollars. So if you have public opinion saying, hey, I don't want to eat more artificial colorants on my cereals, then you got, for example, cereal companies taking out those artificial colorants and looking for natural colorants, which is great for companies making natural food colorants that can be used for those type of products. And then when we are talking about novel products or novel solutions, in our case, the way that we approach investing in this, we have a very strict thesis where we put sustainability in the center of the discussion. So they are always sustainable solutions. We basically work on transforming the way that humanity produces. So we try to find ways of not only replacing petroleum, but also other kinds of treatments that go in different industries that harm the earth. We also invest in some medical developments that may not be directly tied to sustainability, but we ensure that they are not harming the environment, at least. So I can't think of any of our investments that have generated any pushback, although they are very sci-fi related, like they are very novel things, but the way that we structure our investment focus, we are always aligned with public opinion. That's not to say that we look into what the public says to invest, but that we have such a strong conviction that we what we are investing is making the world a better place that public opinion just usually follows.
Hmm. Thank you. It's also very inspiring in the way that you feel this responsible process because very often investment associated with some money making machine, and it's also very nice to remind our podcast listeners that life is also changing, and we see companies and investment ecosystems also changing, and there are a lot of sustainable ecosystem which are valuing human life as number one. I have one more
It's
question,
yeah,
because this is topic of this year, so I can't not ask you. How are artificial intelligence and machine learning transforming biotech research and investments?
of course we have to talk about AI. So basically, it's transforming it's transforming any other industry, obviously in a very particular way. There's a lot of data going around, especially, for example, in genetics. The way that humanity made this progress with software was that every year the cost was dropping in half, while with gene reading information, it's dropping by a fourth every year. So that's how you get a lot of cheap ways of understanding the genetics of any living organism. And now AI is just basically accelerating that. There's a lot of genetic information, but also like a lot of AI being put to use to understand all the information going around. And as a personal view, I say that every startup is using AI now, but I feel that it's going to be very similar to what it was the internet. So when the internet came out, it was like, we use internet. So it was like, wow, they use internet. And now, for example, when you go to the bank, you don't ask the bank, hey, do you guys use internet? That would be like a very silly question to ask. I think that we're heading into that direction, and biotech is no exception. We are seeing a lot of improvement in, like I said, there's a lot of data with the experiments, and there is not enough computing power in the human mind to make recommendations. So that's something that it's being very big. But for example, I recently interviewed a founder of our portfolio for my podcast about deep tech startups, and it was fascinating because he's working one step after what AI does. So basically, you have a lot of people, a lot of startups working with AI. He has a startup that focuses on novel molecules. And although the startups are at the first step of the value chain of making models to predict which molecule is going to interact better with the other, and that's going to greatly influence the chances of working and going through regulatory approval. The next step, which is actually testing, because you can get all the information you want, but then you have to go into the physical world and try what the AI model just told you to do. This is extremely, extremely expensive too. So what's the point of having all this data if you have to spend a lot of money then to try? You are not going to be able to try that. So they're basically reducing by 100 times the cost of doing this test by using quantum electrochemistry. So I think that yes, AI is changing biotech, but it's also very important to think around biotech, around all the things that AI is not going to be able, or let's say it's not that it's not going to be able to solve, but that the part of the solution that AI is bringing is going to be pretty much useless if you don't have a whole infrastructure around that.
Thank you. And last question, any advice for newcomers in biotech world? It can be a scientist or a businessman, any stakeholder.
So basically, it's going to be the opposite advice depending on your background. If you have a scientific background, it's very important to learn the fundamentals of finance and some VC math, how investors are looking into the scientific ideas. And if you have a business background like myself, um, it's more wise to work with someone that has the scientific background. I do not recommend going through 5, 8, or 10 years of studying to get into biotech. It's way more efficient to work with someone that has gone through that path.
Thank you so much, Juan, for this podcast. And this was a podcast of Mental Growth Network. Today we discussed life science and life science investments. And we had a guest, Juan Pablo Orlov, who is specialist in business administration and management and working right now creating amazing projects in life science. Thank you so much and welcome to our podcast. And was happy to hear you. Bye bye.
It was a pleasure being here. Thank you very much. Bye bye.